The morning I found out my daughter had sold my lake house, I was sitting in my recliner with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand, watching the Cardinals fight over the feeder outside my window. That was 3 months ago. Some days it still doesn't feel real. My name is not important. What matters is that I spent 41 years as a structural engineer in Columbus, Ohio, raised 2 kids mostly by myself after my wife Patricia passed from ovarian cancer in 2009, and I retired in 2021 with what I thought was a clear picture of my life ahead. I had my pension. I had my 401k. I had the small craftsman on Elmwood Drive where I lived for 26 years. And I had the lake house up in Kelly's Island that Patricia and I bought the summer before she got sick. That lake house was the last place she was happy. I couldn't have told you the price of anything in this world before I would have sold that house. My daughter. I'll call her my daughter because that's all she is to me now. Not a name, just a title she barely earned. Married a man named Clifford 8 years ago. Clifford was the kind of man who always had a plan and never had a job that lasted longer than 18 months. He sold insurance, then he flipped houses, then he got into cryptocurrency, then he started a consulting firm that, as far as I could tell, consisted of a logo and a LinkedIn profile. My daughter thought he was ambitious. I thought he was a man who was very good at explaining why the last thing hadn't worked out. But she loved him, and she was my daughter, so I kept my mouth mostly shut. They had a son together. My grandson Owen, who just turned 7 and has his grandmother's eyes and absolutely none of his father's slipperiness. Owen is the kind of kid who stops to look at beetles on the sidewalk and asks you what their names are. He is the best thing to come out of that marriage, and I want to be clear about that, because what happened later was never about Owen. It was never his fault. The trouble started quietly, the way it always does in families. About 2 years into Clifford's consulting firm, my daughter called me and said they were behind on their mortgage. Not a little behind. 4 months behind. She said they didn't want to lose the house because of Owen, because of school districts, because of stability. She cried on the phone and I listened to her cry and I thought about Patricia, how Patricia would have wanted me to help without hesitation. So I wrote a check for $19,000 and I told her it was a loan. She said, of course, absolutely, they'd pay it back in installments. I had it in writing, not from a lawyer, just a piece of paper we both signed at my kitchen table. I thought that was enough. I was 64 years old, and I still believed a piece of paper between family meant something. 6 months later, she called again. The consulting firm was picking up, she said, but they needed a bridge loan to cover payroll. Clifford had brought on 2 contractors. Could I help? $15,000 this time. Same terms, same kitchen table. I said yes, again. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known without looking harder than I was willing to look, was that the consulting firm had no payroll, no contractors, and no clients worth mentioning. The $15,000 went into a joint account and then, over the next 6 weeks, into a down payment on a boat. A 22-foot chaparral bowrider that Clifford named. I am not making this up. Next level. I found this out much later. At the time, I just noticed that my calls to my daughter were getting shorter. Her texts were slower to come back. When I mentioned the loans, she'd change the subject or say things like, "We're working on it, Dad?" with a kind of brightness in her voice that didn't match her eyes when I saw her in person. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself she was stressed. Then my neighbor Hank, I've known Hank Bellamy for 19 years. Our lawns share a corner, stopped me at the mailbox one Tuesday morning in September and said, with the particular awkwardness of a man delivering information he wishes he didn't have, "Hey, I saw a listing for your lake house online." I figured it was a mistake. I stood at that mailbox for a long time after Hank walked away. It was not a mistake. I pulled up the listing on my phone right there on the sidewalk. The address was correct. The photos were correct. There was Patricia's old porch swing, the one I'd repainted blue the summer before she died because she said the white was looking tired. The listing price was $340,000, and the listing had been live for 11 days. I didn't call my daughter first. I called my bank. What the woman at the bank told me took about 15 minutes to understand and another 3 days to fully absorb. 18 months earlier, my daughter had come to me with a stack of paperwork related to what she called estate simplification. She'd brought a notary. She said my financial advisor had recommended it. that keeping the lake house in my name alone created probate complications if something happened to me, and that adding her name to the deed as a co-owner was standard practice. She had walked me through the pages one at a time, explaining each one. I remembered signing. I remembered thinking it made sense. What I had actually signed, buried in the middle of that stack, was a quitclaim deed transferring full ownership of the Kelly's Island property to my daughter. Not co-ownership, not joint tenancy. Full transfer. My name was no longer on that deed. It hadn't been for 18 months. I sat in my car in the bank parking lot for 40 minutes. I am not a man who cries easily. Patricia's funeral was the last time I remember crying in public, and even then I held it together until I got home. But I sat in that parking lot and I put my forehead against the steering wheel and I cried like I was 20 years younger and everything was still breakable. Then I wiped my face and I called an attorney. Her name was Renata Webb, and a friend from my old firm had used her in a property dispute 2 years back and said she was the kind of lawyer who read everything twice and never made promises she couldn't keep. I liked her immediately. She had a small office in Dublin with a dying fern by the window and a habit of writing in the margins of documents while you talked. She listened to everything I told her without interrupting. Then she looked at the copies I'd brought and said, quietly, "When did you say you signed this?" I told her. She wrote something in the margin. "And the notary? Did you know the notary personally?" I didn't. My daughter had brought her. Renata looked at me over her reading glasses. "I want to run some searches before I say anything definitive. But I want you to stop talking to your daughter about the property until we've had a second conversation. Can you do that?" I told her I could. What Renata found over the next 2 weeks was worse than I'd imagined, which is saying something because I had imagined quite a lot in those 2 weeks. The quitclaim deed, on closer examination, had issues. My signature had been notarized, but the notary's commission number didn't match any active commission in the state of Ohio on the date of signing. Renata said this quietly, the way doctors say things they want you to hear without panicking. She also found that the listing agent on the lake house had received an offer, $315,000, cash buyer, set to close in 19 days. 19 days. I had 19 days before my wife's lake house was sold out from under me. Renata filed an emergency lease pendens on the property, which is a legal notice that essentially freezes the sale and tells any buyer there's a dispute. She filed it on a Thursday afternoon. The closing had been scheduled for the following Wednesday. We beat it by 6 days. My daughter called me the Saturday after the list pendens was recorded. She called 3 times in a row, and when I finally answered, she wasn't crying the way she had been on those earlier calls about the mortgage. She was sharp. She said Renata was overreaching, that she had every right to sell the property, that I had agreed to the transfer, and if I'd been confused about what I was signing, that wasn't her fault. I listened to her say all of this. Then I said, "I have the dates. I have the notary information. I have the bank records. I want the $34,000 back, my daughter. All of it, and I want the house." She hung up. Clifford called 20 minutes later. Clifford's voice had a quality I'd noticed over the years, a kind of salesman's warmth that he turned on and off like a faucet. He had it turned all the way up now. He said there had been a misunderstanding, that my daughter had been trying to protect my assets, that they were more than willing to sit down and work this out as a family. He said the word family 4 times in about 90 seconds. I counted. I said, "Have your attorney call Renata Webb." Then I hung up. What followed was not quick. I want to be honest about that because I've watched enough television in my life to expect things to resolve cleanly in the 3rd act. The law does not work that way. There were depositions. There were document requests. There was a forensic document examiner who spent 3 hours looking at the notary seal and wrote a 12-page report that I read twice and understood maybe a third of. During all of this, I did not see Owen. This was the part that cost me the most sleep. My daughter stopped bringing him 2 Sunday dinners. We'd had Sunday dinners at my house for 6 years, ever since he was born. Pot roast or roasted chicken, Owen sitting in the chair that used to be his mother's when she was small. The Sundays were the hardest. I'd find myself setting the table anyway, some Sundays. Old habits. I called my son. I have a son too, younger than my daughter, lives in Portland now. works in logistics, and I told him what was happening. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Dad, she always knew exactly what she was doing." He didn't say it with satisfaction. He said it like a man who'd been waiting a long time to stop pretending something wasn't true. The case moved, slowly, then faster. The notary, when deposed, could not explain the discrepancy in her commission number. Her attorney advised her to stop answering questions. Renata said that was the moment she knew. The cash buyer, once the list pendants was in place, had walked away from the deal, which meant my daughter and Clifford were sitting on a property they'd planned to sell in 19 days and couldn't now move. They were also still behind on their actual mortgage, which I learned during discovery had fallen another 2 months behind in the time we'd been in litigation. Renata came to me in January with a settlement offer from their side. They would return the property. They would sign a repayment agreement for $20,000 of the 34 they claimed. The rest had gone to maintenance and upkeep of the lake house during the period they controlled it. They wanted me to release all claims. I sat with that offer for 3 days. Then I told Renata to counter. Full repayment of the $34,000, return of the property, and a provision in the agreement that Clifford specifically was barred from any future involvement in my estate or financial affairs. They came back with $26,000 in the Clifford provision. I said yes. The deed was transferred back to my name on a Thursday morning in February. Renata called me when it was recorded. I was at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee. A real cup this time, not going cold. And I held the phone and I didn't know exactly what I felt. It wasn't triumph. It was more like the feeling after a fever breaks. Just relief and exhaustion and a long, slow breath. I went up to Kelly's Island the following weekend. February is no time to be on Lake Erie. It was 28 degrees and the water was the color of pewter. But I needed to see the house. I needed to walk through it. My daughter had kept it up. I'll give her that. The pipes hadn't frozen. The porch swing was still there, still blue, though the paint was starting to chip again at the chains. I stood on the porch for a long time with my hands in my coat pockets and looked out at the water. I thought about Patricia. I thought about the summer we bought this place, how she'd stood in almost this exact spot and said, "This is the one, Len." She only called me Len when she was certain about something. She was right, the way she was right about most things. I thought about my daughter too. How she used to run down that same dock as a kid and jump in with both feet, no hesitation, and I'd be watching from the shore doing the math on how cold the water was and whether I needed to call her back. She was always braver than she was careful. I had loved that about her. I still loved it, in the way you love something that has also caused you real harm. Carefully, from a distance, with your hands where you can see them. She sent me a text in March, not an apology exactly. More of a door left slightly open. She said Owen asked about me. She said he missed Sunday dinners. I didn't answer right away. I needed to think about what I wanted to say. And I've learned that I think better when I don't rush. After a week, I texted back, "Tell Owen his chair is still at the table." I didn't say anything else. I didn't say anything to her about trust or forgiveness or what comes next. Those are long conversations for another time, maybe, or maybe for never. I genuinely don't know yet. What I know is that the house is mine. The chair is there. The porch swing needs repainting. I bought a quart of blue paint last Saturday, the same color as before, Hale Navy. The one Patricia picked out of a fan deck at the hardware store in the spring of 2007 because she said it looked like the deep part of the lake. I'm going up next weekend to take care of it. Some things you just keep doing, not because they fix anything, not because everything is okay, but because they are yours and you are still here and the work is still worth doing. The can of Hale Navy paint is sitting on my workbench right now, next to a brush I've had for 15 years. I keep looking at it. I've been thinking about what this whole thing cost me. And I don't mean the legal fees, though those were real enough. I mean the other cost, the kind you don't get a receipt for. There were nights in those 3 months when I'd lie awake in the dark and run the whole thing back from the beginning, looking for the moment I should have seen it coming. The first loan. The paperwork at the kitchen table. The notary I didn't know, Every time I ended up at the same place, I had chosen to trust when the evidence was asking me to look more carefully. That's not self-pity. It's just honest accounting. What I've come to understand is that the way things unfolded, the way they had to unfold, was a direct result of choices. Hers, his, and mine. My daughter didn't end up in that position by accident. Clifford didn't end up in that position by accident. Clifford didn't charm his way into a fraudulent deed transfer because he got unlucky. And I didn't get the house back because fate intervened. I got it back because when Hank stopped me at the mailbox and said those words, I didn't collapse and I didn't avoid it. I made a call. Then I made another one. Then I sat in Renata's office with the dying Fern by the window and I told the truth clearly and completely and I let someone competent do her job. That matters. The doing something part. Not the anger I had plenty of and it didn't file a single document. What moved the needle was staying clear-headed enough to act, even when what I really wanted to do was get in my truck and drive to their house and say things I couldn't unsay. I think about Owen a lot when I think about all of this. 7 years old, none of this was his choice. He was just a kid who stopped coming to Sunday dinners and didn't know why his grandfather's chair was empty. If I had let my rage run the whole show, if I had burned every bridge in the name of being right, he'd have paid for it too. So would I. The restraint wasn't weakness. It was the most important decision I made in the whole ordeal. My son called me last week from Portland. He said, "Dad, I'm proud of how you handled it." I didn't know what to say to that. I don't think I handled it gracefully. I think I handled it the way you handle something heavy. One hand at a time, watching where you put your feet, not looking too far ahead. That's not wisdom. That's just not quitting. But here's what I do know. When you've spent 4 decades solving engineering problems, you learn that a structure either holds or it doesn't, and the difference almost always comes down to what's underneath, what the foundation is actually made of. I found out what mine was made of this winter. It wasn't glamorous. It was a dying Fern and a document examiner and 19 days and a woman who read everything twice. I'll take it. Owen's chair is still at the table. The porch swing still needs painting. I'm still here, and the work is still worth doing. That's enough to start with.